Hi, and welcome to a Small Medium at Large podcast. I'm your host, Gail Heisen, bringing you intimate interviews beyond normal boundaries. I want to thank all of you listeners for sticking with us. We're in our fourth year now. We've done over 100 different shows. We look forward to more shows coming up in this next year, and we're very excited that we're continuing our bi-monthly shows. We took a little month off, so in case you listeners were wondering where we were at the end of September, we just decided to take a little rest, and now we're back in scheduled with all kinds of very interesting guests for you. So I want to thank you for liking, subscribing, sharing, and supporting our show. So let me tell you about our special guest today. I met Oscar Rodriguez from two former podcast guests we had, Venerable D. Hong and Irv Ralova. Many months ago, they invited me to join their Sunday morning Zoom meditation, which is where I met Oscar. They have been supporting and meditating together for many years. Let me tell you a little bit about Oscar Rodriguez. Oscar Rodriguez received two double life sentences at the age of 17. He spent the next 24 years incarcerated in a maximum security prison and was allowed to go to a slightly less secure prison in his 25th year. After serving 25 years in prison, Oscar subsequently was found suitable for release from prison. Having changed the direction of his life, he went from former gang member to becoming a college student and a mentor to other incarcerated people. Since being released, Oscar became a dog trainer and eventually started a successful dog training business of his own. Let's welcome Oscar here today. Hi, Oscar.
Hi, Gail.
It's a pleasure to have you here today. And I have to say, I don't know any of these things about you because all we've really talked about is meditating and dogs. So I'm looking forward to hearing the history of your life. And what I always start with all of my guests is their childhood, because where you grew up and how it influenced your life and your future and what
Mm.
brought you to a decision to join a gang. So if we could start off with the going back into the past, that would be great.
No, absolutely. Um, yeah, I grew up in the city of Los Angeles. A section of it um, that's called South Los Angeles. That sometimes they will refer to it or call it South Central.
Hmm.
And I I literally was born in a USC uh, General Hospital, which is not that far from there. And when my parents brought me home from the hospital, I grew up uh, to the age of 17 in the home that my parents bought in South Los Angeles, and I lived there for the first 17 years of my life.
And what kind of family environment did you have? Was it a loving family, or was it a family with difficulties, or was there trauma? What was your childhood like, with your family?
It's very interesting because when I think back to it, my mom and dad were very loving, very caring, very nurturing with us, with meeting my siblings, and yet it was very a lot of turmoil with each other, and because they had a hard time um, in their relationship with each other, we I witnessed that. My siblings witnessed that. So there was trauma in that. My father was very hardworking. He was a blue collar worker. My mom was she worked on and off, but she mainly stayed home and raised the kids. And at my father's um, his way of thinking, right? Because they were a lot older, and they just did things in accordance to one cultural norms of where they came from, and my parents came from Mexico, uh, and and my dad was um, very violent with my mom as a kid, and and uh, and he was very strict with us. Very, he was. the way I used to describe it was old school. That he
Mhm.
would take a belt to us if we got out of line, and he was very used to giving utilizing corporal punishment. In Yeah, so it was it's very interesting because there was the fair every year, Shakey's Pizza every other month. So much so that um, it was a family custom before I was born and throughout my childhood. We would go to Shakey's and to the arcade there, and so there was all these family things, and going to rodeos and once a year, and going to the carnivals, and yet there was this violence that was also part of the normality of family life inside the house,
Mhm.
but that we were instructed, or even non-verbally, that we wouldn't talk about this outside.
Mhm.
And yeah, but so that was very traumatic in that way, because from the earliest years of growing up, I, I I often wondered if I was going to witness my mom killed in front of me, and when they were in disagreements and fighting, and my father was uh, beating on her. You know,
I'm sorry. Did you say that you witnessed him almost killing her?
I know. Well, as a kid, I thought I was. That's what I was. Was this
Seeing.
what is this what I'm about to see?
Mhm.
This
So
was a
that was the level of violence was so intense of
mhm,
what we call domestic violence. And
yes.
I understand what you're saying about the cultural, the belt, and the generation because my father was the same way, and we have the generation that was more of the you got the backhand or whatever, and you never talked back to your mother or father, or you didn't
Oh
do those things.
no,
And
no,
the
no.
generations now have no idea how different
Oh,
that was. And part
absolutely,
of it was them carrying on from what they learned from their parents. So we forgive knowing that they didn't know any better than to be
absolutely,
physical as a way of teaching. That's,
absolutely.
so, but it's hard for others to understand because then it became the other way where if you put a finger on your child, all of a sudden they're arresting you.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Gail, because it seems that we've gone to the other extreme.
Exactly. That's that pendulum thing. And those children will be different. Those children will probably be tough and hard on their kids because they had it so easy. Who knows?
Who knows? Yeah, 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 yeah.
So, uh, are your parents alive today, your mother and father?
My mother is. My father passed away 2.5 years ago.
And did they stay together all those years?
No, they ended up separating. They ended up separating. Uh, it started more visibly that my mom's uh that she was she started talking about it more and confronting him that she was no longer happy, that she hadn't been happy, and that she wanted a divorce before I was incarcerated at 17. But they ended up separating once I was incarcerated. By the time I was 19, 20, they had separated and divorced by that time.
So you grew up your whole life with both parents in the house, and the
Yes.
separation happened when you actually were separated from your family as well. Anyway, so I'd like to ask about this. First of all, you received double life sentence. And what were in all this time, we've never discussed this in our meditation, so I have no idea what you were sent to prison for and what a juvenile lifer means. I didn't know that a juvenile could even be given a sentence like that. I thought a juvenile goes to a juvenile place and then they come out, but this sounds like you were tried like an adult, but you were a juvenile. So could you explain what you did and what happened and how that decision was made?
Yes. Well, I'll start off a little bit of how I wound up in a gang and how that
Yes.
got me into this in committing being involved in a crime that one that I ended. The result of it was a double life sentence. And growing up in South Los Angeles, at the I was born in 1977, raised in throughout the 80s and early 90s in South Los Angeles. And at that time, it's interesting to me when I think back to it, Gail, because at the time I thought that gangs, it was a normal thing, that it was what all young people experience, whether they want to be a part of it or not. They experienced the conflicts that existed outside of the home. And I thought that was, again, I thought it was normal throughout the US.
Mm-hmm.
When I thought about the world, or I reflected on the area of South Los Angeles. That's where I drew my information from as a kid, and I assumed wrongly, but I assumed that the problems of gangs existed everywhere, and they engulfed all life. But it doesn't, and it didn't yet. It did in my environment outside of the house. Um, and let me explain a little bit about that. The area of South Los Angeles was, when it came to the youth, and even it affected some regular families, because my family were working class people. They were not gang members. They didn't grow up that way. They didn't understand that. To my mom and dad, that didn't even make sense to them. Um, for all fairness, gang culture, if I can call it that, it's more of an American phenomenon, because it as I got older and I started looking into these things, many of these things, gang life, um, began in America, in these immigrant communities. And some of the gangs in Los Angeles go back to the 1890s. And so
Wow.
some of the history of some of these gangs is pretty old in America. In Mexico, and in other parts of Latin America, how gangs started coming up in over there is through deportation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting. But in South Los Angeles, a lot of the gangs that were there had been around since the 1950s, 1960s, and and there was these generational within the gangs conflicts, that were fights, stabbings, and even murders, and so there were these feuds going on within these gangs. And so when I grew up, where I grew up, there was um, this thing with kids where it was normalized to ask each other, not everyone, but the ones that were identifying themselves as being part of the gang, that, or wherever they lived at, whatever part of the neighborhood or whatever block they grew up, and as soon as they started to identify with that gang, they would start asking other kids, "Hey, what gang are you from?" And even me, when I first started hearing someone asking me what gang I was from, I, I would tell them I'm not part of a gang, and then they would ask me, "Where do you live?" And by default, that's what I would become. They would tell me, I would tell them, "Oh, I live here," and they would say, "Oh, so you're from this gang?" I would tell them, "No, I'm not," and we'll get into a fight. And eventually, those back and forth conflicts, living in when I think back to it, living in fear of thinking, okay, I got to walk to school, but I have to go through these 2, 3 blocks and then these other 3, 4 blocks. And these kids, not all of them, but there's going to be kids that I'm going to run into. They're going to ask me to identify myself, uh, in what gang am I affiliated with?
Mm-hmm.
And even if I say I'm not from here, by default, where I live, identify me with the gang. And if they don't get along with them, I would then either get jumped or get into a fight. And so this was my experience growing up. So there was always um, the sense of survival. as a kid, and every more often than I would like to admit, I would hear from other kids the same age as me when I was 7, 8, 9, 10. The whispers from other kids how someone's older brother got killed down the street, or someone's older brother was stabbed last week, and so these things will filter down to us as children in elementary school and junior high. So there was all this newsreel, if I can call it that, that was circulated by word of mouth from kids to kids of what was going on.
Right, and it makes it almost sound like this is the normal way of living here. This is not,
Hmm.
and I have to say, I grew up in New York City, and
Hmm.
we didn't call them gangs, but it had to do with whichever, we were hanging out in the streets, but you hung
Hmm.
out in parks. And so
Hmm.
instead of the gang name, it would be, well, if you came, like I hung out in Bound Park. So if you were in
Hmm.
Bound Park and some kid came from Casino Park or from some other
Hmm.
park, then everybody would be like, "What are you doing here?" And it'd be a whole, tough, rough thing. And I watch
Yeah,
kids, get beaten with their ribs are broken. All because they just came over to this park. And this is a middle class neighborhood. This isn't Los Angeles. So I'm saying and it was of course the late '60s and early '70s. But I'm just saying I did see that, and I understand that pressure and also that protection, because when I
mhm,
finally ended up being friends with someone who was actually the son of a mafia family, when I
mhm.
was involved with that family, I was their babysitter. Nobody ever touched me, and I didn't have to worry at night on the streets. Or there was a certain thing, like a protection that came with you knowing this particular person. So it would be the same in a gang. I just want to say
Very
that it's
similar.
not an unusual thing for young people to be either drawn or pulled into this situation because they feel like that's what I have to do.
Absolutely, and it's very interesting that you say that because, left to our own devices as children, these tribal way of thinking begins to unfold. It's not, and it's not funny. It's just I thinking back to it, it made me chuckle because it. I thought about the book, The Lord of the Flies, right?
Mhm.
And when these kids are left to figure things out in this island, in a lot of ways. Uh, it almost seems to me that when I think back to my childhood, I caught the back end of it was still normal for kids to go outside and be kids and play hide and go seek
Right.
and be up in trees and making slingshots and making your own slingshots by cutting down branches off of trees and fixing your bikes and all these things outside this life that used to exist for kids outside, and out of this was born, um, even before I was part of a gang. Uh, we're from this neighborhood or this area, and we started to identify with a geographical part of of the city. And hey, those kids are from down the street. They don't normally come over here. What are they doing over here? And so yeah, it's very interesting. And two, once I did make a decision, and not so much because people were telling me, "Oh, you have to be part of a gang," um, but because I ended up thinking to myself, one, this is normal. Um, um, this back and forth conflict and fighting and people putting pressure on you to identify yourself with a gang, that this back and forth. I finally said, you know what, I'm gonna. I made a decision to be part of the gang that where I grew up. Once I did that, the gangs that were friendly with them or in good terms with them, and they would ask me to identify myself, and I told them the name of that gang, they backed off,
Mhm.
and I thought that was really interesting. And as a kid at 12, 13 years old, that seemed to have given me some level of power that I didn't used to have.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, there was some. I was impressed by that. Uh,
Mhm.
it was very in a very tangible way. I felt that, and Yeah, even though it was very super, very on the surface thinking, like, whoa, me by just saying that, these kids all backed off.
right? So did you then, so around 13, is it safe to say that's when you started becoming involved with, did you stay with the one particular gang that was your neighborhood gang?
Yes,
And is that what led to your incarceration, was being involved in this gang?
yes. Eventually, it graduated, or to the me committing, being involved in the crime for which I got double life. Yes.
And so what was your crime that they sentenced you for?
It was a gang related murder on members of an opposing gang to the gang I was part of. And members of these two gangs had been fighting with each other and shooting at each other and killing each other, for many years. And at the time that this happened, um, that the crime I got arrested, that I was involved in, and got arrested for and received a double life sentence for. Um, since 1992, I got arrested for the crime that I was involved in 1995. In 1992, the part of Los Angeles that I grew up in, which was South Los Angeles, um, was had the unflattering distinction of being the murder capital of in the United States at the time.
Mhm.
And so when I think back to that, I'm still like left speechless that I survived that period.
That you didn't get
One,
murdered yourself.
mhm,
I say that's amazing that you didn't get murdered yourself. I mean, that was on the table, I'm sure.
absolutely, as a gang member or not as a gang member, because um, uh, like earlier that I shared how old some of these gangs are and how long they've been in these neighborhoods in Los Angeles, in that people either knew someone, had a family member, a cousin, a brother, a sister that was part of a gang, or they had an uncle, or they had a friend who had a brother. Someone by some 6 feet of separation knew someone. That's how long many of these gangs have been around in these areas. Um, so yeah, it's a miracle that I didn't get murdered myself as a kid, like
Yes.
so many other kids did.
And I guess the only gang name I ever remember hearing was the Crips, I think was a gang. The Crips, was that a Southern California gang?
That's a gang that started in Los Angeles. Yes.
Mhm. So did all the other members that you were with in the gang get the same sentences as you for for a gang related murder? Did everybody
Well,
get?
when I got sorry about that. Do you
Yeah.
want to finish your question?
No, that's it. I'm just wondering if everyone got the same sentencing.
No. When I was arrested, there was three other people. They got arrested a few hours before I did, and it was three other people. When I got arrested that evening, they released two of them, and 3 days later they released the third one, and it was I came to understand, at least basic, from what the detectives were telling me. They wanted me to say what happened, how it happened, who was involved. And by the age of 17, I was so indoctrinated or brainwashed into thinking that this was normal and that there was this code of silence I had to maintain, um,
Mhm.
that I preferred incarceration and losing my freedom for the rest of my life than to talk about that. So,
Well, wouldn't your life be threatened outside?
yes,
If you had given information, then your life and maybe some of your family would have been harmed by
and
the
that and
gang.
that's and that's an interesting thing because in sociology and psychology, there's actually ways of understanding the exact same thing you're describing. Because even if no one is actually threatening you, because that threat has been put in place by an act, yeah, by actions, previous actions that either me or other people that I knew witnessed, the people that had first put that rule or demonstration in play were no longer even needed. A kid would now can deduce that, hey, if I say something, what you just described or shared is something, is a conclusion that we can pull from, if I ended up talking, right? That I will no
Mhm.
longer be able to, because again, as a kid, I'm only thinking that the world must be just like where I grew up. Where am I going to go if there's
Right,
gangs everywhere, right?
right,
Um,
right.
so yeah, no, absolutely.
So, okay. Question number three. Did you have a girlfriend or family that came to visit you when you were in prison for 24 years, or were you left there? I know my dad had said to me when he went to prison, no one in the family came to visit him. He was not there for 24 years, he was only there for almost two, but I know that that had to be hard for him, and I'm wondering what your 25 years was like, and if your family abandoned you or whether you still had their support.
Yeah, no, because my family were working class people. They couldn't, they did visit me, they just couldn't do it often. I
Oh,
would get visits from them every 4 to 5 years. Sometimes every 7 years, I would get a visit. And in the visits that I did get, it was my older sister was the one that made those visits happen. Um, right when in 1995, my sister was she had got married 2 years prior to that, and when I was sentenced to the double life sentence and sent to adult prison at 17, um, 3 years into my sentence, my mom and my younger brothers came to visit me with my older sister. Um, my sister brought them, and that was visits played out that way. In that way, my sister would drive my mom and dad to come and see me. For a long time, I didn't see my dad. Yeah,
what prison were you in? And was it far from the Los Angeles area?
yeah. In the beginning, well, for 20, I want to say it was 23, 24 years. Um, I was typically far away from home or from Southern California. Most of these prisons, first of all, they're really far from any major cities. And so the first prison that I went to was in Kings County, which is like 4.5 hours away from Los Angeles. And so that was the first prison that I went to. But because my involvement in the gang, and when I went to prison, I fell into uh, well, prison is broken up by racial lines, and also by geographical lines. And because I grew up in Southern California, I fell in with the population of being what was called in prison a Southern Mexican. Because I came from Los Angeles and culturally I'm Mexican. So, and again, this is something that's become so. Even when I went to prison, it was so normalized that the correction officers asked me when I first walked into prison, um, who did I house with? They asked me at 17 years old, and I remember asking me, was I a Southerner or was I a Northern Mexican? But they told me you must be a Southern Mexican, but you come from Los Angeles. And I remember just thinking, yeah, that's who I am, and that's what I told them. And
Mhm.
but because of the way gangs work in the streets and in prison, that's kind of how things are molded without even verbally saying it, but that's how it happens. And but it's so normal, or it was so normal, that even the correction officers asked me about it, and while they were in a way coercing me, telling me
But
you're Southern Mexican, right? That's what you are. That's how you. And I'm like, Yeah, I think back to it. I'm like, yeah, ask a 17-year-old, right? Yeah, yeah, but that's how. But I ended up being in so many prisons. I was in. I first went to Corcoran State Prison, a level 4, which is a maximum security prison. I stayed there 6 8 months, and I got into my first violent altercation in a in an internal um, uh, uh, gang removal. uh, uh, I was asked because I just got there and I was identifying as being part of their group. This is how young people are raised within that group, very tribal. Um, Going, like I said earlier about growing up in South Los Angeles, a lot of kids left to their own devices kind of develop this tribal way of living. And in prison it was very simple. It was, I mean, it's very similar. Only thing that it was more uh, uh, it had been developed a lot more. It was a lot more developed, a lot more rules, a lot more structure, um, in how they conducted their affairs in there. And so when I went in there
So,
and they asked,
so I'm just sorry to interrupt. So
yeah,
inside the prison are different, say, some of the members, for what, just say we're talking about the Crypt gang or whatever the gang is. So you have your group of gang members that are outside in the streets, but then you have your collection of group members that's inside because they're not going to give up any other fellow information because they don't want to be killed themselves. So they go to prison and then they make more contacts or meet more other people to join their gangs or have gang fights within the prison. Sounds, I mean, is that, would that be fair to say that they form gangs in prison or there is not, it's not, that doesn't happen?
no, 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 there's a variety of reasons how someone winds up. I ended up in prison in the way that how I shared it. And but people go in there for committing crimes. Maybe they were the person that committed the crime. Maybe they weren't the person that committed the crime. If they were gang members in the street, there's a variety of situations, right? And yet in prison, it has developed its own gang culture. And because part of that shape, or part of the thing that has shaped gang culture in prison, has been race. Well, I don't. That's not actually accurate. It's been more wanting to control the resources that are available to the incarcerated,
Hmm.
and race was just like not a byproduct, but almost a byproduct. And groups just separated into what we have today. Um, and so when I came into the prison system in 1995, and because my culture, how I look, I it was already assumed, because typically it's what happens. Um, uh, I A person falls into the group in prison that identifies as being part of Southern California, that
Right.
is culturally Mexican. Yeah.
So I can see then how difficult it is when they send prisoners far, far away from family members who are working people. And how can they take 8 hours of driving on
Mm,
their one day off? So I could see how difficult it would be for you to have family
oh,
contact during that time. So,
yeah.
so I have to say, my when I ever think of these things that, like, if I was told I was going to be in prison for life, I
Mm,
I think all I'd want to do is kill myself. So I can't
mm,
imagine how mentally you can deal with such, being given such a sentence and and survive 25 years inside the prison, which is I believe it's like its own city. It's its own little world in that prison, entirely different than when you come out here. And did you ever feel that desperate when you were in there? Did you ever feel that hopeless or that desperateness of like, I just don't even want to go on anymore? I mean, did you ever have that kind of rock bottom experience?
I had a my own version of a rock bottom experience without the thinking that I didn't want to, without me thinking I didn't want to live anymore, right?
Hmm.
Um, um, but I had my own version of it, this is horrible. This is, which is hopelessness, right?
Yes.
In it didn't. Well, for me, in my experience, it didn't. It seemed not to matter what prison I went to. In 1996, I was in Corcoran State Prison, and then I went to Pelican Bay State Prison, and then I went to on and on. And it's in the life that I experienced in the previous prison existed in the prison that I went to. So it was for sure an experience that how I was interpreting or understanding it felt like I was in this never ending nightmare. And because um, for all the for the short period of time that I was a gang member in the street, nothing that I had experienced up to that point to going to prison prepared me for what I experienced once I went inside because um, so many things. Well, one of the things was the way of life for a person in prison is very, very, very different from anything outside of the prison. For one, and living in this manufactured, controlled environment um, is extremely different from anything outside of it. It's in the middle of a desert typically. If you do get a chance to look outside uh, um, and you get a view between the buildings or from a little scratch in the back of a window of a cell because they paint the back of the windows and so we can't see out. And but whenever there's like through aging and some of the paint falls off, and you look outside, all you see is dirt, no trees, no grass. Occasionally, you'll see a bird or something land, um, but even that, you just see dirt, concrete, and steel, and so there's that, and then there's the psychological um, aspect of it that comes from the pressure. If I thought I was on survival mode, or I believe that growing up where I grew up put me, those conditions put me in this space of being in survival mode. Um, Going into prison put steroids on that, of being on survival mode. And I mean, it didn't matter where I went while I was incarcerated, it's at least this is my experience because of everywhere I was moved to, everywhere I was housed, um, there was violence in the daytime and at night. Occasionally, more than occasionally, you would hear someone sharpening a steel knife on the floor, and it didn't matter if there were 10 cells away from you. It's a sound that vibrates through the entire building at night, and after being in prison even a year, you become intimately aware of what sound makes what noise.
Mhm. Well, your senses have to be also heightened. I would think your psychic, your hearing, your smells, everything, so that you can be on high alert at all time because somebody can attack you and not necessarily a guard but a prisoner, and you need to be on the alert all the time. So I want to jump from all the intensity of the prison life, which is a lot, and none of us, unless we've actually been there, can really ever understand the full experience of it. We can only imagine that in our minds. I have the experience of knowing from my father what federal penitentiary was like, but I only have that from his experience. I don't know my personal self, except that I just feel like I wouldn't last a day. I mean, I can't imagine mentally or physically being able to survive this. So I want to move on to the positive things that happen, but before I do, I just wanted to give one mentioning about your views of the prison system. Is it
Mm.
really made there to actually rehabilitate yourself, or do you have to really work hard to try to find ways of rehabilitating yourself where they may provide more things for you to do more crimes than they are finding things for you to do more of a positive nature? I mean, I know I want to go into the things that did change your life, but I don't know if that prison is set up. I mean, that was, I thought the whole idea is prison's supposed to be there to rehabilitate and the persons can come out in society to be good working individuals. But I don't think that seems to me what I see, that most people, when they go in prison, they go back in prison again or they continue on. This, your story is a success story. Herbs is a success story, which I want to talk about again. I want to talk about again in a minute, but I just wanted to get your personal opinion of, because you've been to enough prisons now to say, well, in this California prison system, I can say they offer nothing or they offer a lot, or what is your opinion? And then I want to go into the pluses.
It's very interesting, Gail, because uh, uh, having uh, being able to use my lived experience and having the privilege of hindsight, right? And looking at how where I grew up, and then my experience in prison. Um, I think that there's things that we can do as people, not to guarantee that certain results are going to happen, but we start seeing, I think, correlations, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we don't spend um, resources to fund a school uh, with what can make that school successful. Um, I understand that since the days of Mesopotamia, we understood that if we wanted to make certain sectors of a country prone to crime and other uh, things that would lead to crime in sectors of a community, uh, uh, don't offer them any education or very poor education, and make it very hard for them to feed themselves, right? There's like for lack of a better word, I'll say a recipe, right? And this is something that I began to understand as I became an adult in prison. And through reading, I started noticing that uh, how to put these things together to make a community um, uh, lose some of its population at, younger and younger is by constructing it a certain way. When I think back to where I grew up, um, it seemed to have a lot of these elements. Um, 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 a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployment, schools they weren't properly funded, teachers they weren't adequately, they were uh, impoverished themselves, um, buying school supplies out of their own pocket a lot of the times, having classrooms that had more students than they actually could control or teach, and in neighborhoods that had yeah, it had a lot of crime, and so that's one. So when I went into prison, um, a lot of things were shocking to me, and one of the things that was shocking to me that I could still see in my mind's eye, um, was that a good 60 to 70% of the population was uh, African American or from or from a country that spoke Spanish in the Western Hemisphere, right? Not everyone that was Hispanic in the prison system was Mexican, but they came from somewhere in Latin America, and that was at least 60 to 70%. You know, it in and I was at the end of the 25 years that I was incarcerated, I must have been in anywhere from 9 to 12 prisons. Uh, in 24 of those years, as we said earlier, it was in maximum security general population prisons, and in the the percentage the racial breakup of the prison was pretty much the same. 60-70%. Half of that was either African American, the other half of some uh, Hispanic cultural background, and and then you'll have smaller populations of of white incarcerated folks, and then slightly smaller populations of Asian Americans, and even smaller population of Native Americans. They were they were incarcerated, and but yeah, that was to me. I remember thinking I didn't understand how it was that was the result, but it seemed intentional to me.
Mhm.
And I remember thinking, even though I didn't understand how to explain what I was thinking to myself, I remember thinking I put myself in a series of situations where I landed myself into a net that was placed for people that look like me. That's what I drew from that.
Mhm.
So once I was in the prison system, um, I there was no programming, there wasn't anything. No, I didn't think about it, and I didn't have anyone tell me, "Oh, this is available for rehabilitation." I didn't start hearing or thinking about um, rehabilitation or changing um, in some kind of systematic way until years later. Um, Whenever I went to every prison once a year has a classification. They call it a classification where they meet with the incarcerated person, and they discuss um, how they're doing, and what recommendations they can make so they can have a productive or um, some level of normalcy in prison where they're not getting in trouble.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's a counselor assigned to the incarcerated person that they get to see Monday through Friday, but they have to write a request, right? But they would just be like, "Hey, so many people would tell me it's really hard." A lot of people they work there, like the counselors I was assigned to, they would tell me it's really hard because right now this group and that group are in war, meaning they're fighting each other every time that the doors to their cells open up. Is as hard as it is when you can't stay out of trouble,
Mhm.
you know. And and and, and I think I was a call wanted to come up, but I just hung up on it.
It's
I
good.
don't know if but yeah,
Yeah, that's
hopefully
fine.
it didn't mess up.
No, no.
But
Are we on? Oh, so this is a Zoom from a phone? It's working really well.
this is actually a Zoom from my iPad.
Oh, wow, from the iPad. Okay, so that's working
Yeah.
very well.
It,
So I want to ask you, when you were released from prison, what year was that? 2000,
19,
2000. So you came out with COVID when COVID
right
was
before.
right before COVID. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That was the year I adopted my dog Bruno. Uh, I wanted to say, when you came out, there was so much new changes. Well, you didn't see the changes because you were in there, but all this technology happened. And did you have a
Mm.
lot of trouble assimilating into life outside the prison walls after basically you became an adult and a man while you were in prison? And then you came out a free man. But all those years of development from 17 on, the growing adult and all the things that we're learning, you were in there missing whatever. I know they don't let you see all the news, they don't let you see everything that's going on. How was that to come out in 2019, whether it's a cell phone, I mean, just even the kind of cell phones, when you went into prison, there were no cell phones. People didn't have them readily available. I mean, that wasn't going on. The kind of
Yeah.
self-driving cars where there's no person in the front seat. I mean, I'm just saying it's sort of like going into a, like going from like 1950 and then all of a sudden coming into Star Wars. And I'm just saying that has to. I'm just wondering what that was like, and I want to talk about what all the positive things were that helped you along the way to do this.
Ah, it it's really interesting because a lot of the was what prepped me to start looking for things that out using the word positive things to begin to change my life. Right. Um, it was the same violence in prison that eventually um, who I was as a young man and the things that I had learned in my environment and growing up with my family, just being a young person, right? Um, Thinking, oh, I know better than my parents, and because there was a lot of that going on inside of me as a kid too, and thinking I had it figured out, and
Every
they just
kid,
didn't, you know,
right?
they didn't understand the life that existed outside the home, and I needed to. I was of the thinking that I needed to do the thinking for myself, and I would get myself through this. Um, uh, that part of my personality or who I was at that time in prison, that who I grew into um, by year 7, year 8, year 9, while I was incarcerated, and the pressures, the fears, the stress of prison and the violence uh, finally clashed, and I started to experience a variety of things. Anxiety was one of them. I remember um, uh, experiencing a level of stress that I hadn't been introduced to before, and I think it was because I had been living under this type of stress and fear for so long, from at home that I grew up in, the neighborhood I grew up in, and now on steroids, this stress and fear that exists in prison took it to all-time highs that I had never experienced before. By the time I was in prison 8 9 years, it started manifesting into physical anxiety, in levels of stress that I couldn't. There was times I couldn't even sleep at night. I was so stressed, um, and and eventually it started to show up as anxiety when I would walk out of the cell, and so I felt that who I was at that up to that point in the realities of prison, um, they came they came head to head, and I was losing that battle internally,
Mm. Well,
and
9 years later, I mean, it's 9 years to that point.
and so I started secretly, and I'll say secretly because um, uh, uh, the group inside of prison, or people that are incarcerated, or people who I lived with while I was incarcerated, even from the different groups, but the group I lived with, um, it wasn't an accepted thing to say, "Hey, I'm having a hard time."
Right.
People just didn't do that. And a lot of that was organically just grew uh, in prison, but a lot of that also came with people, with men, like it did with me, from our the life we started in with our families. This is
Mhm.
not how I was raised, to talk about my problems and to admit I had problems. And so when I first experienced anxiety, um, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what I was experiencing. Um, and the little bit, um, when even just the word anxiety, I had this conflict inside of myself because I thought, I'm a guy, I'm a man. How can I be experiencing this? And
Mhm.
and it says a lot of how I was raised, to me, that I started to think this is something that will typically happen to a woman. And just me saying that, remembering that coming out of my thinking at 23 years old, 25 years old, um, shows how backwards or how far back the education that I grew up under to view
Well,
things
see
that
that
way.
I'm just saying from what we've talked about, because I want to go on to now the healing part because we're at our actual hour, but we're gonna have to go for a longer. Is that you've had violence around you all your life from growing up, and when it's the two people that are your parents and you're seeing violence inflicted on it and it becomes the norm, even though in your gut you're feeling, I don't want my mother to be hurt. I'm saying that's a different level of violence that, say, some middle class child in, Wisconsin may never have seen any kind of physical anything ever in their life or to their own self. And so you already had that like planted inside you, and then you go to your neighborhood, which is, in order to survive you have violence, and then you go on into prison where there's more violence. So now how did you get out of this? I want to say it's like were stuck in a whirlwind of cyclical violence, which you became part of, and inflicted violence.
Yeah.
What Let's talk now about this part of the show part now, how that all changed. Tell me, when did that pivotal moment come, and was it from Buddhism or meditation, or did you meet Di Hung, or how did what changed that came about that you got from life sentence to being released from prison, and what you're doing now in your life, that's, the positive parts. So let's go over. We now know what brought about the foundation for all of this. Now, what did we do to find all the healing?
It's very interesting because when I was before going to prison, I didn't want to go to school. A lot of the kids I grew up with, male and female, the ones that made decisions like I did to be part of a gang, even a few that weren't gang members, it was popular not to go to school. Be like, hey, we're gonna go and hang out. We're gonna go and do this. So by the time I went into prison, um, um, interestingly enough, in these maximum security prisons that I found myself in, I because of the conflicts, I I I I participated in to be part of this group in prison. I started living or spending a lot of time in the hole. I started spending 2 years at a time in the hole throughout this beginning period of my incarceration
And the
because of the
whole,
conflicts.
the
Mhm.
whole, the whole
Yes,
is, what is the whole?
it's the jail inside the jail. In in prison they call it administrative segregation. Most people might, from movies, they might know it, or it's similar to what in movies they call the hole. Is when they segregate an incarcerated person from general population and put them by themselves for a while, with other, in this case, with other next door to other men that also are being punished for some crime or some violent act that they were involved in prison.
In
And
prison.
so
That's
when I was
solitary confinement, what we called
that,
solitary confinement, the whole.
yeah,
Okay.
solitary confinement is another name for it. In prison, they have, or they used to have, the SHU, which is the security housing unit. Inside of prison, incarcerated people will call it the SHU, which is solitary confinement. And once I was sentenced, not in a court of law as we know it outside of prison, but the court inside of the prison, they just sentenced a person to the jail inside the jail,
Mhm.
to solitary confinement. And this was so I was in my third um, um, 2 year period in solitary confinement, and by that time, being back there, I was around people that were in solitary confinement for a lot of years. Some of these individuals had been in solitary confinement since the mid to late 70s.
Oh
So
my
there was this um, um, new uh, a lot of people back there would were going to college, were reading, were studying something, But back then, your family had to pay for the college courses, so not everyone was going. But when someone would go, they would share their books. So there was this promotion and support for education amongst the incarcerated, and they were supported. It didn't matter. It typically didn't matter what race the incarcerated person was, um, and they would support each other in their education and ask each other, "Hey, do you like to read? I have these books. I have these courses. I have these materials." So when at 18, 19, 20, 21, spending these beginning years in solitary confinement, I found myself around men that they were educating themselves, and many of them were putting themselves through college, and promoting and encouraging other youth. And I was one of those young people to read. They were encouraging me to read, and when I was there, I fell into that habit of reading and studying and getting involved in education, this informal education that was being that was put together again through incarcerated people, and really that's how I learned how to read and write and how to spell. Because when I went to prison, I I I had I stopped actively going to class in the sixth or seventh grade.
Hmm.
So when I went to prison, that's how that's the grade level that I spelled in. That's the grade level that I read in. That's the grade level that I thought in. So, um, being in solitary confinement around people that were encouraging and actually, um, I started to see examples of education in a good light now, and I started put I started reading. I started making my own um, dictionaries. In a way, I started writing down words that I was interested in, and I wanted to learn how to spell these words and what these words meant. I did that for the first 4 to 6 years that I was in prison, that I was in segregation and isolation. And so it was through this process that helped me read better. It was through reading that I started finding personalities like Ulysses, Jason and the Argonauts, and I remember reading Edgar Allan Poe's complete tales and poems, and I started whether it was the Telltale Heart or the Pit and the Pendulum, but I started running into characters. They were asking themselves questions about their own character, and this is what started to introduce me to thinking about what was important to me, um, standards of morality and things like that. And I was like, standards of morality. Let me see. Let me
I,
write down.
I have to interrupt you because you picked such a word that I can't stop laughing. But my father, when he went to prison, he was older than you. He was 28, but he couldn't read or write, and
Mm,
he learned that in prison as well. But the judge had sentenced him. It wasn't only he was sent to federal penitentiary, but it wasn't only because of his car thieving operation. It was because the judge told him he had no morals. But when she was sentenced with that, he didn't know what the word morals meant. He had to look it up in the prison dictionary to find out what he had been sentenced for. I just,
absolutely.
and it was the word morals, exactly what you're talking about. So, and he said it
It's
was the positive thing for him. He had a spiritual experience when he was in the solitary confinement, and he turned his life around in prison. So he feels it was a wonderful, it was a very positive experience, but he was only there for 2 years, not for half his lifetime. And so I'm just saying you come from a very positive space for someone. I did not know that you had been in prison this long. I've only been meditating with you every Sunday. I had no idea that you've only been out this short of an amount of time. So knowing who I know in my meditation, you've really an amazing person to have risen above all of this crap and been able to see through into a higher space and a higher consciousness and level of being to the fact that you mentor and help others. So that's what I want to talk about now, about how you got involved with your dog training, and how coming out of prison, what, I'm not sure if you're a Buddhist or if you're just a meditator, or what were the things that took you from that place to the place of the guy I meet who's very together.
And to me, this is where I'll reintroduce or use the word rock bottom, right? Because the experience that I just shared, in the stories that I just shared about my experience, led to my rock bottom. And my rock bottom was the levels of stress, the anxiety I was experiencing, the hopelessness, right?
Yeah.
In living in solitary confinement and thinking, the understanding to the up to that point, that if I continued down the path that I was on, the end of what I called my life was it was coming sooner than I thought. Now,
Mhm.
it was really close. That was what my understanding was, and I thought to myself, if I want to live and live in a way that is feels good, even if whatever small level that would be, because I was still incarcerated. I didn't know what that looked like, right? I didn't know what to do to create that. So it was really scary for me to leave the life that I had known up to that point, in attempt to reach out to grab hold of some other life, right? And that's when I started, because I was already running into through literature, people like Joseph Campbell, Viktor Frankl. They started introducing to me in my thinking about spirituality, about what is my purpose, what if my life is a certain way, and it doesn't feel good, it's because of there's a lot of inconsistencies in misalignments in how I'm living. And so I started forcing myself, at first as I started to think, read these things, the gang life started to like come to the forefront of my thinking, right? It's this, how much more upside down than this, right? And so I started to intentionally think about the way I had been living, and eventually it started to, I felt a lot of shame, I felt a lot of regret. I felt a lot of remorse. I started to, because interestingly enough, just like you talked about and you shared about the experience your father had in prison, he didn't know what the word morals meant. So, in a lot of ways, this process introduced me, to me and how I've been living and what I had learned through books. I finally started putting words and understanding to how I've been living. And the truth was that I didn't like who I was at that point. And through this, by applying this process to my life, I was using this process to look at myself, and contemplating what I was finding. And the more I did that, the more sick I made myself feel. And 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 I thought to myself, if I'm going to change, I need to look at these things. So I would force myself to lean into these things, because it was no longer acceptable to me, the process I used as a kid, that was very much staring at things on the surface and saying, this is cool. Okay, what makes it cool? So I started to break these things apart. In other words, I started thinking more critically about the things that I was doing and the choices I was making. And 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 what resulted from this was me feeling sick to my stomach, because what I was calling love, or what I was calling respect, um, was really, uh, not treating people well. If anything, treating people, uh, eh, very harshly, very violently, and it wasn't humanely. And so these things, and I can still feel, not okay with that. And I said, good, I shouldn't feel okay, you know.
Right.
And so this is what started moving me, creating space between me and that life, and started priming me to what to the life I was then going to create. So I started talking to older Native Americans, Muslims, people that were practicing Christianity, people that were practicing just a Wicca and different things, just to see what their thinking was. And because it seemed to be obvious to me what was missing was a spiritual and a moral compass.
Hmm.
And I thought to myself, okay, so now it's time for me to go on a journey, and and start to investigate what I need. And so, in a lot of ways, I started to develop what it eventually became a trust when I encountered something, to know that that's what I need. And that through time happened through questioning, identifying, questioning, acknowledging, discussing, sitting with, contemplating, revisiting, writing things down, reading through things, researching things. And eventually, this process brought me to Buddhism. And in 2009, I met a monk and a nun that would come into prison in 2009. And this was like 10 years before I met Venerable D. And I remember when I met them, they were the first Buddhists that I had met. Up to that point, I had only read about Buddhism in small little paragraphs in books that I was reading. So I was already primed. I'll call it that. I was already primed with an interest in Buddhism, because whenever whenever I thought about how can I cultivate love for people, even if they've hurt me, how can I cultivate forgiveness through reading and through a lot of the research that I did, it would point towards Buddhism, that they had systems of how to practice these things. And I thought, oh great, where am I going to bump? Where am I going to meet a Buddhist, right? And where am I going to meet a monk? Because in prison they didn't even have those services. None of the prisons I was in.
That's what Dee was saying when we interviewed him, that when he went to the chapels in these all these different prisons, he said you could find books on all these different religions, but nothing on Buddhism. And he couldn't, he said there was things you could do, sweat lodges, there were Native American things, there was Muslim things, there was for all these different religions, but for some reason Buddhism was not there. So I'm so
Yeah,
glad that he's brought what he, what books and things he's been able to put in these libraries. And I'm not sure why they don't have them. So
it
I'm
is
sorry
very
to
true.
interrupt.
No, no, and no, no. In Gail, please, it's very interesting, because everything you just said is in your conversation with Venerable D is true. And because I remember when I began this journey of looking for uh, uh, uh something to live a spiritual life, or introduce a spiritual life in to my life. um, I first thought about my cultural background, and since I've been out, I've taken a DNA test to look at more closely, or more to get more meat and potatoes of what makes up who I am culturally, right? And according to the genetic test that I took last year, I'm 54% American Indian and 39% Spanish, and then there's things start breaking up a lot smaller, because of a lot of movement. And there's like 3% African, sub-Saharan African, and 1 point something Jewish. I forget the pronunciation of Jewish, somewhere in Russia or something, right?
Oh,
But
oh well, yeah, it could have been Ashkenazi, it could have been
yeah, yeah,
uh yes.
Ashkenazi, and so I, at least from just talking with family, I knew that um, uh, American Indian culture was in my family, but because of colonialism and just governmental policies in Mexico, um, I never even met a family member that still spoke their language, their Native American Indian language, or even practiced in their traditional ways.
Right.
My family practiced Catholicism, and so I thought to myself, okay, so am I going to lean on Catholicism? So or am I going to investigate Catholicism to see if that's right for me, or am I going to investigate Native American spirituality? And I couldn't find in the conversation with Native Americans in prison a system that I could use to rehabilitate myself, for a lack of a better word. Of all this violence I grew up in. Excuse me, that I grew up in, and I was part of up to that point. Um, so this is why, in with all due respect to my Christian brothers and sisters, that I just didn't feel in researching in my own investigation that those systems were right for me to take me where I needed to be or where I needed to go. So as I kept on investigating, uh, I my understanding in what I was reading and what I was investigating uh, started to point very strongly towards Buddhism. So when I first met uh, a Buddhist monk in 2009, I first sat in classes that they used to hold once a week. I sat in their class for 3 years until I finally converted to Buddhism, and I started corresponding with them. I started in form of letters. I started asking. I started showing up to these classes with notes. I started reading, devouring books, and coming with more questions. And then I finally started to do practices. Um, Once I started to understand more in the in these beginning processes, in beginning stages of studying Buddhism, it just convinced me more that this is the vehicle that I need to do what I want to do, which is create a new life. Um, and that's what gave me my this different life outside of the violence I shared about earlier.
That's a very clear description of this where the pivotal change began. And also, it's very amazing that you did that research. I'm wondering if you have, because the Native Americans I know from Mexico that I've been deeply involved with for, I think it's almost 40 years now, about 35 years anyway, 35 years, is the Huichols. And I'm
Yeah,
wondering if you should check into that a little, or I'll be happy to do that with you on another, on a privately on another day, and at least give you some information and things about that, because that may be part of your, heritage coming from Mexico, and they're the descendants of the Mayans, and they hold the history, thousands of years of the use of peyote. And I'm told they're the ones who taught this to the Native Americans in that are living in, say, New Mexico and those areas now, which were really part of Mexico back, in when the days before or whatever, the old days.
yeah, no, yeah,
So I think it's a beautiful thing that you honor the Christianity that would have been what you were taught at from your family and your relatives, and that I know how strong it is in Mexico and how religious some of the people are. So it's really a beautiful thing that you could acknowledge that that's a beautiful religion and that is fine, Catholicism, but that it wasn't exactly matching what you needed to find for your spirituality. And actually, in prison, you were able to finally get books from these Buddhists, people that came, and it was your own self searching this out. So you didn't have somebody guiding you along to do that, but you knew that something wasn't right in the type of religion you had grown up with. But you found, and I never think of Buddhism as a religion. I just think of it as a way of being, or so I don't know. Somehow, anyway. And so then, did you start doing meditating back then in 2010? And have you
I
kept that then? So you've been a meditator now for more than 15 years.
I started meditating and doing other practices drawn out of Buddhism since 2008, since 2011. I started and I became I my my life in prison became like I was living in a monastery. I
Hmm.
Is the best way I can describe it, and to the point that when I the monk that I met in 2009, or later on, some volunteer, the Buddhist volunteers that I was meeting in the prisons that I was going to, because now I started, they started, there was volunteers coming in the prisons that I ended up being after that, where they would give classes once a week. And eventually, when I met Venerable D, um, their description of how I was living in with my sharing with them my daily practice, which was meditation, doing prostrations, and doing chants and other practices drawn out of Buddhism. Um, that they would describe it as if I was living in a monastery.
Wow.
And
Do they
it,
allow you to do that in prison, to chant and if it's your free time that you're allowed to do that, then they don't say shut up or,
in the privacy, I would do it. I would chant internally in the privacy of my cell, and
oh, okay.
because and because and because Buddhism in spiritual practices, once a person becomes okay, wanting to live their life, even if it's a little bit, in my humble opinion, a little bit uh, uh, wanting to align their daily activities with drawing from religious or spiritual principles will separate you very dramatically in prison.
Hmm.
And to be honest, I even see that out here outside of prison. Once a person begins to gravitate or lean into uh, 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 even if it's a little bit of a spiritual practice in a serious way, um, it's gonna separate that person from the community they live in, and the people who are more accepting will become smaller in number or open to it. That's been my experience, but it was very obvious in prison. So I would do it internally in the privacy of myself, because most of the people that I was celled up to with in prison, you live to a cell. Many of them didn't understand it. They didn't want to spend the time to understand it, or they yeah and it was very foreign to them. It was very foreign to me, which is why for me it was so important to spend time investigating this.
Hmm. This is a wonderful foundation for, and you had the time there because you had the time in prison to be able to spend that time reading those, absorbing, and spending the time thinking about it without getting interrupted well, those are the, I remember our my husband and I are very dear friends of Timothy Leary, and when he was in prison he said it was the best time of his life because he could focus on his book writing. He could read, he had no interruptions from others, and he could really he used it as a time to spend his time writing and reading and really focusing on that, which that would, and then of course trying to escape, but that was beside the
Yeah.
point. So
Well,
I
yeah.
want to talk about because you and I have discussed dogs during our meditation and the love of dogs. And I noticed my Bruno, he's sitting right back here he keeps coming in and out of during our conversation. What happened with you? And was that in prison that you started to learn about training dogs? Or was that something you chose to do when you came out of prison? Or can you tell us about your relationship with dogs and the fact of what you must have learned about their unconditional love and how they're so much better than humans
Yeah. I, I,
and
I
unconditional love.
during the 20 on my 24th year during my incarceration is when I went to a slightly less security. It was a prison that with slightly less security. It was what they call a level 3, and in that prison I went to, they actually had a dog training program, and
Oh.
that's where in that last year that I was there in prison, I would I submitted an application to be considered to be part of this program. Luckily, how I was living the 10 years before I went to this slightly less prison with less security, um, they said that they accepted me. They accepted me into the program, and I was in 3 rounds of the program. Uh, each round is 12 weeks long, 12 to 14 weeks long, and then I was released. So this is where I was introduced to basic principles of dog psychology, behavior, dog behavior, and training methods. And so I hadn't seen a dog since I was a kid at that point,
Oh.
and what I noticed that it was a lot easier um, to love, be understanding, be empathetic, and just have my heart open with an animal than it was with humans. Um,
Mhm.
with humans, I was in survival mode almost all. The experience that I had around the humans I was around had me at very high alert and survival mode. With animals, with these dogs in this program, I wasn't. I was I even feel my heart softening up right now just thinking about it.
Mhm.
um and whether it was a dog, if the dog that I was assigned to vomited in his crate or used the restroom, my first thought and instinctual thing to do was, let me get the dog out, let me clean up after the dog, and let me shower the dog. That was like the first thing that arose in my mind and in my heart. And I saw it um, from my practice in my Buddhist practices. I saw my relationship with the dogs in the program, or my as a student in the program, as the Buddhist practices that I had been doing, but now times 1,000.
Oh.
Um, they were allowing me to practice what I had been practicing in Buddhism, these practices that I was drawing from Buddhism and being helped with by monks. um, the dogs were helping me to experience it, more of it, faster, and being more attentive, and being more mindful. It was really interesting. And to the point that me and many of the other people that were part of the program, they also practice Buddhism. With the ones that were practicing Buddhism, we would call it, it's like spending time on a mat meditating, but you're standing and walking with the leash with a dog.
And so they didn't let you keep the dog in the prison, right? They just brought them to you once a week, but they would bring you a same dog that you would get to you would get to know each time and keep continue training. Is that?
Well, they actually 6 dogs were kept in the prison in kennels outside of the cells of the people that were in the class.
Oh.
And yeah, these dogs stayed for those 12 to 14 weeks in the program
Oh,
while
that's
they were
great.
going through this training to be rehabilitated and be prepped and prepared for adoption,
Hmm.
because
That,
many
oh,
of these dogs were being rescued from high kill shelters.
great.
Yeah.
What a wonderful, that's just a wonderful thing and a wonderful program. So then after you learned this, you were actually did leave the prison with a skill that
Yes.
you, and then did you actually work for that particular company after you left? Did you work for that dog company or did you have a reference or how did you, because I know it's not easy to get work after you're coming out of 25 years of prison.
No.
I would hire
No.
you, but
I it took me after like 6 to 8 months after I was released, somebody that from the program uh, that I was inside the prison to in training dogs, they contacted me and told me that a dog training facility in Los Angeles was hiring if I wanted to send them an application, a resume. So I did that, and they hired me. Um, uh, which is it's an independent company out here in Los Angeles. And a few years later, because it's about to be 6 years in December 24th. It's about to be 6 years since I've been out of prison. Um,
Mm.
and 2 years ago, I was actually hired by the same program I was in while I was incarcerated to go back into the prison and to be an assistant trainer. And I did that for 8 months. I was in two classes or two uh, um, of these training programs, um, training the students who are incarcerated individuals, and it was very powerful because now I came full circle in a way.
Yes. And that's not the only thing. Don't you do other mentoring? I don't, could you talk a little bit about the things you do to help people that, so that young kid, I think it's young kids, I'm not sure what, that you do that's to help prevent them from going down the route to end up in prison. And then you've also been doing things to help prisoners. And when I heard that in our last meditation, that you guys go back to these prisons to help them, all I kept thinking was, how could you do that except because you have the strength from your Buddhist practice? But in my mind, I'm thinking, I think if I had to go back to a place I'd been incarcerated in, my heart would be in my mouth and I would not be able, I'd be in such fear that they were going to somehow keep me by accident or not let me back out again or something. I mean, I would be filled with those kind of fears. So, yeah, very courageous to go back to those places. And also, when someone like you goes in to speak or teach to someone, you're not some psychologist who's reading from a book and saying this is what's going to help you. You're saying it from experience, and that carries so much more weight than any of these, to me, than any of these highly educated therapists or psychiatrists that would go in to help a prisoner. So my hat's off to you guys for going back and doing this work and going back into the trenches. So could you share a little bit about that? And I know we're at an hour and a half already, so we got to try to sort of wind it down, but I feel like we have too much to say.
I appreciate it. And no, yes, since I've been out, I haven't, I don't see how my life can be separated from doing volunteer work or working with an organization visits either whether it's youth that are incarcerated or adults that are incarcerated, or even doing work out in the community with communities and populations that are living in communities that are marginalized or in danger of losing some other young people to incarceration. So I network and have created networks with organizations since I've been out. They do this type of work. So I found myself uh, going back into the adult prisons with the Positive Change Program, which is the name of one of the programs of how I wound up as an assistant trainer with the students inside of an adult uh, of male adult prisons here in California. And then I started networking. I was networking with a program out in Orange County in Southern California. I started going back into juvenile detention centers, mentoring young people that were incarcerated. They are incarcerated, and so I started to do that. And I've given talks out here in the community in groups of young people or even adults, just to share with them a little bit of my experience and my story and who I am today, in hopes it touches someone, because even though that I went through down the rabbit hole I went down and I spent the years that I spent in prison, a lot of the people uh, uh, throughout that time in my life, from my childhood to my teenage years to my adulthood, the few people that that whether there was a judge or someone that was incarcerated, that spoke to me in a way to try plant a seed of hope. Even if it didn't affect me in the time that they talked to me, it never actually left. In those seeds stayed inside of me, and eventually found the ways into the ground inside of me, and eventually grew roots and developed into what resulted into the thinking of wanting to change, in changing and actually changing. Um, and so this is why I do it. This is what I do, and why I do it. Because I say to myself, I look at how it happened with me, even though we're all very different. Maybe somebody will have a response in that moment and change, or it might be someone that's a late bloomer like me and say, you know what, okay, enough is enough, and it'll happen years later. However it happens, I hope that some of these people, both men and women, somebody can be rescued from um, the life that they're living, and so much of it that they've been trained in a way unconsciously, set up in a way to use certain things to do their thinking, but not realizing that it's been placed there, either by family and how they were raised, or community and what was available to them and what they thought was real. Because, and I say that what they thought was real because when I came out of prison, um, to me, the experience that I had and still have every so often, there's a movie called The Truman Show. And in that movie, there's the main character, um, Jim Carrey. He grows up in a Hollywood set, but to Jim Carrey, his character, he thinks that Hollywood set is real life.
Mhm.
And when I came out of prison, it's how it felt like to me. It felt so what we call society. It felt to me if I would walk behind one of the buildings, it was just a prop,
Mhm.
because in so many ways it felt like I just landed from outer space. I came back into planet Earth, and everything is so different. And what I thought was what memories I have, yeah, it was just very interesting. So this is what I think about with many of us who are still struggling, and grew up in environments and homes, so that has them still trapped in these having these challenges. So this is the things that I just participate in, and since I've been out, I own my own company now, a training company. I work with animals, and it's called Underdogs Canine Training, and I use that platform in a lot of concepts in dog training to deliver a message and share my story, and try to draw out parallels of what they may be going through, what happens with animals, and how I work with them to introduce them to new ways of behaving.
Would you
Yeah.
mind slowly saying the website that you have for that so that any
It,
of the listeners
mhm.
on Spotify or Google Podcast or wherever, because on YouTube I'll have a description and I'll have your website there, but just in case anybody's listening that would love to contact you with it. I have to say I lucked out with an amazing dog, but I'm not a good dog trainer. I do the exact opposite. They might come to me trained, and by the time they're finished with me, they know they're untrained. I'm
No,
just
absolutely.
too lovey-dovey or something. I don't know, but I'll be quiet, and if you could just say it slowly so they can write it down.
uh, uh, right now, on social media, they can find me at Underdogs Canine Training, Oscar Rodriguez, and I exist on Facebook in the same way, on Oscar Rodriguez Underdogs Canine Training. Um, but as of yet, I don't have a website. I just exist on social media,
Okay.
and a lot of my work, which I'm now working 7 days a week, has been through word of mouth, and now people finding me on social media. So people can easily find me there, on Instagram at Underdogs Canine Training.
I'm hoping somehow you're going to get another dog that's going to need a home and that you'll have trained it and you'll call me up and I'll say, okay, I'll drive right down there. We're coming to get the dog.
Bless you, Gail.
They forget how to be a dog after they live with me. They become a person. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my goodness.
Anyways, I think I have to wind us down now here, but I want to just check quickly to see if there was any questions because we covered a lot of my questions in in your answers that I don't have to ask them to you again. And oh, there was one thing I wasn't sure. How did you get that one last question, which was takes it back a little, but how did you get released from like did you apply or did somebody say, "Oh, he has good merits here," or was there a special program that said, "Oh, if you're in life," because I think to me if you said a sentence, two sentences of life, how would you ever even think you could possibly get out? And how did that? I just was wondering how that, if we could say that sort of quickly, just how did you get out?
Yeah, no, no. Up to that point, I really was convinced that I was going to die in prison. And what ended up happening was that in 2006 or 2007, there was a case that went to the United States Supreme Court, and this case was Miller versus Alabama. And Miller versus Alabama brought the question to the United States Supreme Court when that case was brought to them. Uh, could a minor be given life without the possibility of parole, or was that unconstitutional? And the United States Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional to give a minor life without the possibility of parole. I had two life sentences with the possibility of parole, but in California that was still a death sentence. It
Oh,
was considered a death sentence, and to in other words, death by incarceration. And
right.
so now when that happened, that sent ripples across the United States. What the U.S. Supreme Court did was left it up to different states to implement it through however it saw fit. And what California did was created a bill and left it to the population, the people of California, to vote whether to vote yes or no. And so in 2009, it came in as SB 9, that giving a young person life without possibility of parole was unconstitutional. The people of California voted for it, so that started what resulted in what gave life to the second bill, which was SB 260, giving a minor a meaningful chance at parole, regardless of how many life sentences they have, if they were tried while they were still minors. Uh, uh, and they ended up extending the age group to up to 25, because science has shown that young people, young men, their prefrontal cortex, or their ability to reason, doesn't come to full maturement until they're 25. So that was
Why
voted
they
into
drive
the.
their car 100 miles an hour.
So it was through these bills, the passing of this case in the United States Supreme Court led to these bills passing in California, and that's how I got out.
And did like other prisoners or because I know you don't even get a lot of I know all the news is censored, so you don't get all the information there. So with something like that comes about, then the prisoners are informed so they know they can is that so you can find out that that's happened and then you can take the matter into your hands and try to
Yeah.
appeal, and that's what you did.
Well, uh, there was wonderful attorneys. Elizabeth Calvin. There's another attorney here that's a professor at USC. In Heidi Rummel, which is one of the attorneys, which is a professor at USC. They both were the creators of the bills that actually uh, the reason why I'm out, and so many other people are out. And they came to visit people like me. They visited me and other individuals while we were incarcerated, to talk to us about what was happening and what they were doing. Elizabeth Calvin was the lead attorney for the Human Rights Watch here in California,
Mhm.
and Heidi Rummel, the attorney, the professor, also the college professor at USC. They came to talk to us. They were on this tour throughout California prisons to talk to us about it. and they had us filling out applications
Oh, that's
because
so
of what.
cute.
Yeah, and they eventually created what eventually brought so many of us, brought me home.
That it's so wonderful to I have a future podcast coming up with a friend of mine, and she worked with another woman. It was the other woman who was the driving force, and they've changed a bill, I think, in 13 states now, because people that were children that of that come from famous people are often kept from seeing their dying parent because the stepmother or stepfather won't allow them to see them because they're nasty. So
Mm,
they were able to pass a bill finally and went through all through legislation that it has nothing to do with money. You're not entitled to any money or anything from the dying person, but you are entitled to see them. You are not to be prevented or not allowed to go in to see them. So it's really good to know in the way politically how crazy the world is right now that some good things can actually happen by people taking it on their own and really fighting for something. So these two women did something that affected your life and Irv's life and so many individuals. And I mean, you have to think about, if all we have to all think about is look back at who were we at 17? You're not an adult. You're not. I mean, you may have gone through a lot in life, but you're still not. You still haven't lived your full life yet. You're just a child. I mean, you're a child approaching adultness, and that's often when you make the most stupidest mistakes, and that's when you hate your parents and all the crazy things that go on as you're a teenager. So how you could be
absolutely.
judged as a whole lifetime, I mean, so anyway, I didn't know this, so I'm really happy to know how that all really occurred.
I'm forever grateful to these two women, and all of the change that they're responsible for.
And what were the
Because
names again?
Elizabeth Calvin, the
Liz.
attorney for the, she used to be the lead attorney for the Human Rights Watch here in California, and
Okay.
Heidi Rummel, which is a law professor at USC.
It's a wonderful combination, and they really did. It's. I'm just saying, it makes you feel like there's hope for other things, knowing these things.
Absolutely.
So
And,
we're gonna close now because we're almost actually had a 2-hour show that we didn't plan on. So I was wondering if there's anything else you want to say before we say goodbye to our listeners.
I want to thank you, Gail. I really do appreciate you and allowing me to have this conversation with you and all your listeners. And I want to add to that, uh, uh, to all your listeners, anyone that can hear this, just to um, never to give up on hope. In because um, if anything, even in the darkest moments of what may seem as the darkest moments in our lives, if we begin to actively move in the direction and searching for it, that and find the thing to give us hope, uh, it can lead us out of to pretty dark spaces in what we call our lives.
That you moved my heart very much with that. It's a very powerful ending. Well, thank you so much for being here and joining us today, Oscar. I really, really loved this time together with you. I want to thank my son and my daughter for posting and producing the show for us. And I want to remind all of you listeners, remember to share your stories because stories can heal. And have a really, really wonderful week. And we'll see you soon. Bye.